Okay, it's Tuesday, May 27th, 2025. Present for this video are myself, Thomas Coriell, Margot McMillan, and Howard Marshall. The purpose of this video is record an oral history of the 2025 Living Traditions Fellowship recipient, Howard White Marshall. First, Howard, can you please tell us about the traditional arts that you practice? And also tell us from whom you learned, when and where?
Well, it's a long story. I guess if you say currently practicing, I guess it would be traditional fiddle music of north central Missouri, the Little Dixie region. Yeah, I'll just say that I inherit a family tradition of music and pleased to do so. And currently, I guess you'd say my principal instruments are fiddle and guitar and banjo also, but I've only been playing the fiddle since about 1968. So I played everything else before that, which prepared me nicely for the complications of learning to play the fiddle. But I'm from a family of musicians on both sides of the house, and going way back to the early pioneer days in Missouri, 1820s is when we arrived here. One branch, and then before that, Kentucky, Virginia, North Carolina, Pennsylvania. So I'm lucky to be an inheritor of the ability to play music. And as such, I guess I always want to stress that I'm an ear musician. I learn best by listening to others and sitting next to others and watching them. I don't read violin music, although I read choral music. I sang in choirs when I was in college and in high school, so I know how to read music, but I've never stirred myself or become ambitious about learning to read notated violin music. I don't think it's really necessary in my case. Since I am an ear musician, I can pick up tunes very quickly and have 300 or 400 tunes I could play in my active repertoire, and maybe a few more in my inactive repertoire. Active repertoire meaning I could play them off the top of my head, without much suggestion.
That's amazing.
So, in my family, going back several generations, the girls typically played piano, sometimes flute. If they're rebels, they played the fiddle. But we also play a lot of classical music in my family. And my most important influence, although he died before I could learn anything about his fiddling much, was my Marshall grandfather, who was kind of the principal fiddler in his generation. And he played all the ways you could play the fiddle in a little railroad town like Moberly, Missouri. He played the fiddle as taught to him by his father and Uncle Richard way back just after the Civil War. Played for dances in the country schoolhouse where he was the schoolmaster in Randolph County, Missouri. And then at some point in the late 1880s and 90s, he decided he wanted to play violin music so he could play in the German professor's orchestra in the gazebo downtown on Sundays. So he did that and took lessons with the really notable German immigrant Johannes Getze, who had played violin in Brahms' orchestra and quite an accomplished player. But he also liked fiddle music, this particular music master, Professor Getze, they called him. So I guess the third context for his fiddling was in church, Protestant church on Sunday mornings. He would play hymns as a special thing, with my grandmother seconding him on guitar or on piano or reed organ. And so I always thought that was an interesting combination of ways you could play the fiddle from my town. If you're lucky enough to have an orchestra, maybe you could aspire to play in the orchestra. If you're from a family like mine that like to dance and like all kinds of music, you might play the fiddle Saturday night, for dancers and church-going folk. You might actually play in church. Our church was one that allowed musical instruments in it. Not everyone did. So I've always felt very lucky to have this kind of background, and I draw on that. I draw on the spirits of those people when I try to play music myself, most of which I've learned on my own, but I have had some really crucial models. I wouldn't say teachers exactly, because I can't say I've had a fiddle lesson, but fiddlers like Taylor McBain were very important to me in the 80s, late 70s and 80s. And I would sneak over to his house and play some tunes with him. And it wasn't exactly a teaching environment. It was more like the traditional arts apprenticeship program, where he'd play something and I'd try to play along, and maybe I'd come back a week later and have a little bit more of it. And he'd finally declare that, "I believe you got it, boy," you know. And so that tune, I got that tune. He was a very giving, very loving teacher, and very generous with his knowledge and with his skills, and he would teach anybody who wanted to learn any time of day. So I was lucky to live in Columbia at that time and have access to the great Taylor McBain, one of the really great fiddlers from a former time. I learned a lot from other fiddlers kind of on the sly. I watched Pete McMahon in many jam sessions, and I was his driver in his later years when he couldn't drive anymore, so I took him pretty much all over the Midwest as far as Yankton, South Dakota, fiddle contests. And I learned a lot by listening to his stories in the car, which mean a lot to me. The stories are sometimes better than the fiddle tune, the stories that go with them. So I learned from Pete, and at one point Pete asked me to come out to his house in Harrisburg and he'd show me some things. But I just didn't have the skill to catch what he was showing me. I was not a very adroit player at that point. I could play lots of tunes, but he wanted me to play them like he played them. And he had a pretty narrow description of how he played them. Whereas Taylor McBain, anything you played was great with Taylor, and he might say, "Well, that sounds really good. Howard, how about playing a little bit like this way?" And he'd play a little differently, and I'd go into my head and go home and work that out. Other fiddlers that were very important to me coming up were the Carroll County fiddler Johnny Bruce, whose bowing was the most beautiful bowing you'll ever see any fiddler use. Maybe next to Taylor McBain, who also had beautiful classical style bowing. Sort of introduces another kind of sidebar that we like to assume that these old-time fiddlers were, just plain old country folk that didn't know a whole lot. Well, that's stupid. They knew a lot. They read books. They bought all the records they could. Taylor McBain would go to concerts in Missouri Theater whenever any big touring orchestra was coming through. They appreciated fine music, and particularly the bowing is really important to these fiddlers that I admire. It's not just anything you want to bow is okay. It's the correct bowing to them, So, and that's the hardest part to learn to me about playing fiddle music is the bowing. My old pal John Hartford used to say that bowing is the handwriting of the fiddler, and it really is. Because anybody can figure out how to play the tune. It's how you express the tune in the nuances of making the bow work. That's the hardest part of it, and I'm still trying to figure it out. I finally got kind of what Taylor McBain had to show me. I never got Pete McMahon's fiddle because he had a unique bowing, in my experience, but perhaps unique is too strong, but a very individual. You knew it was McMahon the minute you heard him play. He had a kind of a personal accent into the notes that was really quite interesting. And I never managed to figure that out, how he did that. At one point I just kind of gave up. I'm 80 years old. I figured I've tried hard enough for the last 50 years and I'm not going to spend the rest of my life trying to figure out how Pete played that. But I do play a lot of Pete's tunes, and I have tremendous respect for his impact really across the United States. Probably the most best known Missouri fiddler of all time would be Pete McMahon. Traveled all over the United States playing and judging contests, such as the Weezer contest.
Now, did you second or back him up a lot at contests? Or?
No. He always had others he would turn to. In my time, his favorite backup was Fred Stone King, who played a very hard-driving but spare, kind of bluegrass-based guitar, but without playing a lot of whinkerdinks and melody notes, but really solid open string playing. And Taylor McBain also favored that kind of guitar playing. So, Heinrich Leonhard was a student at MU that Taylor latched onto and instructed him on the finer points of backing up Little Dixie style fiddling. All this has changed because of the influence of Texas style fiddling in contests. So everybody wants to play swing chords in jazz and play some kind of weird close chord for every beat of the tune. It's okay. When I'm in Texas, I love it. When I'm in Weiser, Idaho, I love it. When I'm in Central Missouri, I think it's an intrusion, and it's kind of stepping on, in the jazz vocabulary, stepping on the kind of guitar playing the old-timers preferred. And when I say old-timers, I want to qualify that because I knew a couple of fantastic old-time fiddlers who actually preferred swing chords. So it's this. I just didn't make this up just because I'm a weird guy. Were several really great fiddlers who played that swing-style guitar as accompaniment. Dale Pauley being one, a great fiddler who could also play backup guitar and never played an open chord that I can see. We played in sessions together for 10, 15 years. And the other, Bobby Joe Caldwell, one of the best swing players ever to walk the earth, who I also enjoyed playing in jam sessions with and tried to learn something from him too. One of those people I can learn something from every fiddler I encounter, which is what every aspiring fiddler should do. It's just everything is good, some's better than the rest, and listen to it all and learn about it all and sort yourself out. Over time, it takes some years. Kind of frustrating for kids who want to play immediately, like Mark O'Connor or, I don't know, Benny Thomason or, Dick Barrett. And those guys took 40 years to develop their music, This is the problem with recorded music in a way, and the problem with tune books is that the 8-year-old violin student can take the transcriptions of, let's say, Benny Thomason's tunes, which are online, and play them note for note, and they think they're playing Benny Thomason's music. They might be playing his tune, but they aren't playing his music. So I think that's an interesting distinction.
Very much so.
I have nothing against learning by notes, it's great if you've got it, that's great. I would be a much better fiddle player had I more understanding of how to hold the violin and bow, I do okay, but there's a reason, several hundred years of violin playing have produced 2 or 3 different bow holds that work no matter what style you play. And it isn't grabbing it halfway up the stick and sawing like you're at the sawmill. That's not it. That's music, but not here, not in my house.
I mean,
Is that too harsh?
no. You talk about Taylor and Pete and the folks that you picked up a lot, in orally, right, and listening
Yeah.
and in homes, at jam sessions, even at dances, I'm sure. But are these all hoedowns you play? Are these all? I mean, what kind? It
No.
seems to me that there's a vast. We talk about 300 or 400 tunes. Are these all hoedowns, or what are we talking about?
Probably half of them probably are,
Yeah.
and maybe a bigger portion, a smaller portion, but still a big portion would be waltzes. I love waltzes, and this is something that's distinguishable, I think, in Central and North Missouri, because we play tons of waltzes here, and in the flat keys of F and B flat, as well as the quote fiddle open keys. And if you travel down far into the Ozarks, they'll scowl at you if you play in the flat key, and they might play 3 waltzes all night. I could play all night without ever not playing a waltz, so I really love waltzes. I do play other tunes, of course. Play some swing tunes. I play some rags, and I like polkas, and play a couple of schottisches. So there's the mixed bag of tunes that are other than a hoedown and a waltz. Thinking of fiddle contests where if you play 3 tunes, the third tune has to be something other than another hoedown or waltz. So, does that help at all?
It does, yeah.
In the right direction you want?
Yeah, that's good. That's great. Are pop tunes anything anymore? I mean, I know the world of pop music is not what it once was,
Well,
but
not in the past 25, 30 years.
Yeah.
We play plenty of tunes from the golden age of ragtime,
Yeah.
jazz, and swing, from the 1900s up to about 1965. You know, I play a lot of those tunes. I play tunes that are themes from movies, for crying out loud. You know, wherever the music is that I like, I'll try to figure out how to play it. I've mellowed a little bit over the years. You know, way back. You know, when maybe I was your age or younger. You know, I had kind of tended to believe in the barriers that fiddle players would put between music. You know, for instance, Pete McMahon would hear a tune, he'd say, "That ain't fiddling." He'd say, "That's bluegrass." And what we need to understand is, if you really delve into his personal history, he played a heck of a lot of bluegrass in the 50s and 60s. And at one point, for probably financial reasons, he decided to veer into the fiddle contest world rather than the bluegrass world. He had a good friend named Gene Goforth, another fiddler I learned a lot from, just from being around and watching him. And they used to be buddies. I've got an old
Pete
tape.
and Gene?
Pete and Gene. I used to put an old piece of tape somewhere of them playing jam session together. And when bluegrass became hot, Gene gravitated towards bluegrass, and Pete went off to play in fiddle contests. Those were the big worlds in the 60s, you know, for fiddlers. It would be old-time fiddling and bluegrass, because so-called contest fiddling that evolved in the Texas Western swing context hadn't really hit us yet. You know, that tidal wave was still out in the Pacific somewhere, growing and heading for us. Hadn't gotten here quite yet.
Mm-hmm.
But we play lots of tunes from the 1920s. I don't know how many. There are lots of rags, you know, blues tunes we play. They're recorded by famous bands back in the 20s. And we, you know, people I knew like Taylor and Niall Wilson, Leroy Canny, you know, they listen to all of it. You know, Art Galbraith, they listen to all of it. And it's a process. They might turn what started out as a nightclub hot tune into a waltz, or turn into a fiddle tune somehow, you know. And that's the process. And they did that back in the 20s too, where there were big wars in the 20s, like the recent wars over what's contests doing, you know, rubbing out traditional fiddle playing in Missouri. That's really a complicated question, but there was a big war in the 20s too, when people would say, "That's a record you got that tune off of. That's not real. You know, that's not real fiddling if you got it off of a record." Well, that's baloney. You know, of course it's real fiddling.
If it's a good tune, it's a good tune.
It's a good tune, it's a good tune.
Now, what would you consider as a fiddler here? Do you, and I don't, not to pigeonhole you or box you in, but here in Central Missouri, would you consider yourself a dance fiddler, a contest fiddler, or you don't need a label to be that?
I guess I could self-select some kind of quasi-label. You have to pardon my throat lozenge. My allergies are going crazy in this allergy season.
It is that time of season out here on the farm too.
Yeah, boy, I live amidst many things I'm not supposed to be around. So I would say I kind of tended, first I wanted to play bluegrass back in the 60s.
Yeah.
I played bluegrass mandolin and guitar in bluegrass bands around, and in grad school played in a couple of bands, Southern Indiana.
Mm-hmm.
Really got into bluegrass big time. The thing about bluegrass fiddling that didn't appeal to me that much is it's a really virtuoso style of fiddling. And it's kind of an orchestral style, really. It's an ensemble style, and it's really made for people in an audience to sit and listen to and clap. Or listen to on the radio. It's not dance fiddling. The same
Showmanship,
tune,
more
the
like.
same tunes would be there, but it's a different world. I was more interested in fiddle contests because I knew early on that if you want to listen to some great fiddlers, you know, the cheap way is just go to a local fiddle contest. You'll hear a whole range of styles and qualities of playing, and I like contests because that's where the fiddlers are. If you didn't go to contests, think of all the fiddlers you wouldn't know or you'd completely miss. So I'm not against contests at all. I've been in a million of them all over the country. I've judged a lot of them too, from Washington D.C. to San Francisco. I've judged fiddle contests. So, but I don't think of myself as particularly as a contest fiddler. Contest fiddlers, that's a kind of a little higher rung in the ladder than what I do, because those guys have 15 or 20 tunes that they just play beautifully any Sunday, any Saturday of the year, just perfectly, and interesting renditions with their own sort of practiced improvisations.
Yeah, I always hear the term, the war horse tunes that the contest fiddlers would play, and that's about all they would play.
Yeah, they probably do know many, many other tunes, but if you only go to the contest, that's all you hear. So, but you might hear one of the fiddlers who doesn't make the callbacks play a really interesting old waltz you never heard of. So out in the parking lot, you might accost them and say, "What's that tune you played?"
Absolutely.
Yeah. But I'd say my favorite opportunity to play the fiddle is in a jam session with, shall I say, reasonably accomplished accomplices.
Mm-hmm.
I don't like jam sessions, the big, huge ones with, every level of playing, because it just doesn't. I do go to those, but that's where I get a chance to play. But I like sessions with 4, 5, 6 people that actually want to be there and can really handle anything you throw at them. And so that's, I guess.
Yeah, you have a unique. I've been in several jam sessions with you. I've jammed with you personally, and we've played some good tunes. Not a whole lot, but hopefully more as we go along. But you have a unique approach, I think, in the jam. You like to hear individual fiddlers playing their sort of version of that tune, especially some of these tunes that we all play may have a little different, a different turn or a different style to it, and that's. I think that can be complicated sometimes in jam sessions when fiddlers aren't aware of that, because they're used to going to some of these giant Walmart jams and they're not used to actually being heard. And I always like that approach where you want to take a round at the tune and then let everybody kind of give a pass at the tune and then maybe all play together. Can you talk about that? That's very unique.
Yeah.
Where did you pick that up from?
Well, that's how I came up. I came up in the jam session context. It's really more like bluegrass.
Yeah.
It's a circle, and whoever starts the tune, I want to hear them play the tune.
Yeah.
Of course, in a bluegrass jam, you pass it around to every instrument. Some of my sessions do that, and some of them don't. Excuse me. But if you do that, you get to listen to somebody else play the tune, even though you might play it even better than they do in your own estimation. I like listening to other people play a tune, and I want to hear them play it all the way through before I jump on it. In the way I came up, you don't just jump on it until whoever the other fiddlerist gives you the nod. Sometimes just looks in your direction rather than looking here. They just look at you, and then you're on. You next. And I like that. And then as the tune unrolls itself, I'm great with other people joining in and taking a solo or something. But I really prefer that. But I think the influence of festivals and, in my earlier years, Appalachian fiddle contests, where the jam sessions, their traditions, everybody jumps on the tune immediately. And I hope that doesn't sound wrong, but whether they know it or not, they jump on it immediately.
Yeah.
And a lot of people say that's the best way to learn a tune. And maybe it is, I don't know, but I don't think a jam session is for learning the tunes. The kind of sessions I want to go to are playing the tunes. We will stop once in a while and we'll go over it with somebody who's a deserving beginner, but I don't really like to do that.
Have you taken any students in, or is it more informal and you prefer the jam and the contest?
Well,
and
I've got
meetups?
a lot of students over the years, if you want to call them students.
Yeah.
I've had few who, kids who came over and their mom and dad brought them and they paid, for a lesson. That's the way they wanted to do it. And those generally didn't pan out very well. I'm not an excellent teacher. I guess it's maybe because of my career, as a professor. I'm used to teaching people who can kind of get, and not just sit there like lumps on a log, So I really prefer teaching people who already know how to play the fiddle and are ready to take it to the next level
Mm-hmm.
if I happen to be a good player or learn repertoire. Would like people to learn more of the old repertoire here in our part of the country,
Mm-hmm.
instead of just picking up, June Apple from, Cliff Top or somewhere, okay, we can play June Apple anywhere in the world. What do we play here in, Callaway County, Missouri? We got some tunes here, please, thank you. So in other words, that's the preservationist in me, or the curator in me. I'm kind of like a curator of these tunes. I don't own them. I'm looking after them for the next generation.
Yeah, so with this whole, I don't want to call it a special set of repertoire, but what's been played here in mid-Missouri, central Missouri, Callaway County, what kind of impact does that have, in the community? Does that carry any weight here still? It's like, you don't need to play the June Apples, or you can, but, how does that impact people around here,
Well, I don't know that it has very much impact, but I don't think it ever did, because, in 1910, while my grandfather might have been playing a local tune from Randolph County to dance, he also played pop tunes
Yeah.
and jigs and rags and whatever anybody wanted. So it's a really complicated question. I'm not sure I can really answer it.
Yeah.
But there are some young people around who are very young, some who I sort of dragooned into going around the place with me, like our friend John P. Williams. And I think he learned a lot more than he knew at the time, from me taking him around to these contests and conventions and stuff, when he was still in high school,
Sure.
like a kid. So in a way, my impact might be not really aimed at anybody, but I do my best passing on of traditions with people who actually want to know it, and aren't there just because they're bored or they're babysitting. I don't like being a babysitter
Yeah.
for young people.
You've recorded with John. You have a great release. When was that released? That's a pretty influential release for me personally. It's where I consider you one of the premier sources of fiddle tunes that, because I've been to many jams around the area. I'm in St. Louis, and yeah, you get a lot of Illinois tunes and the Appalachian tunes, but then all of a sudden this thing appears, and for me it is like, wow. I understand you've done a lot of work in academia and in Arthur, but that fiddle record that you made, record, CD, tape, whatever you want to call it, with John, I love it. It's very thorough. Can you talk about how that came about with you and John?
Well, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Well, I happened to be, let's see, where was I? Someplace out west, I guess. Oh, I made the acquaintance of Phil and Vivian Williams,
Yeah.
who created Voyager Records in Seattle, sort of the Northwest god and goddess of old-time fiddling, for 50 years or more, who've now passed away. But I met Vivian and knew her playing from people who had met her at Weezer and would talk about her playing. Very interesting player. But we kind of fell together at an academic conference of the American Folklore Society. I think it was maybe in Portland, Oregon, maybe in the early, maybe mid-'80s, when I was still going to academic conferences. And we both gave a paper on a panel there about old-time fiddling. And so we kind of chummed around a little bit after that, and you always have a fiddle with you, so we started, well, let's play some of these tunes we've been talking about, We started playing, and I realized, we realized at the same moment that we actually play very much the same style of playing, and many of the same tunes. And I've had this experience at Weezer, Idaho also, where I'd be playing out in the parking lot somewhere. Somebody come up and say, hey, that's a Cyril Stinnett tune, or hey, that's a Pete McMahon tune. Why, thank you, sir, ma'am. So it's kind of like that with Vivian. We hit her off as people, gregarious, outgoing people who love the research. She was a tremendous researcher and historian. We love talking about where tunes came from. And so if you think about the history of the country, Missouri sent a whole lot of zillions of musicians to Oregon, Washington, California, Idaho, the Pacific Northwest.
Now, is this in general just moving out west, or you say
Yeah.
these tunes traveling with folks heading to contests out there and they pass them on? Now, obviously, with modern technology,
I'm
tunes.
saying, but going back to the
Yeah.
Oregon Trail.
Oregon
days,
Trail, yeah. So following the Missouri River.
Yeah. Well, but then the Oregon Trail's not following the Missouri River. They're setting off across the prairie.
Across the prairie, yeah.
So you have a lot of tunes that people play in Northern California all the way up to BC that are actually Missouri tunes. For example, Marmaduke's Hornpipe,
Mm-hmm.
who I found that almost every older fiddler I ran into at Weezer and other contests in the Pacific Northwest would know that tune, and sort of that kind of unlocks a relationship with a fiddler if they're playing what they probably figure is a really obscure tune. You never heard this one, boy, and they start playing Marmaduke's Hornpipe, and I said, well, I'm from the next county over, so where that tune evolved, during the Civil War, and then they get over that crushing idea, and we, but move on to their other tunes that we share. So, in a way, Vivian and Phil really liked Missouri fiddling because they knew Pete McMahon, they knew Cyril Stinnett, and other Missourians who'd gone to the Weezer contest.
Cleo Persinger.
Cleo
maybe?
Persinger, they're pals with Cleo Persinger, and Lena Hughes.
Lena, yeah.
And so
And John Hartford go out there too?
No,
No.
never did. He was too busy at the time. So in other words, I had a nice friendship with them.
Sure.
And we were talking somewhere on the phone or something, and they really liked Missouri fiddling. So why don't you make a CD of some of these oddball tunes that you
Awesome.
play,
That's great.
So I said, well, can I bring along a kid, a friend of mine, a high school kid who's learning from Pete and so on, and the future. It seemed like a nice chance to do that. So I put John Williams in the car, and we drove out to the Voyager Studios in Seattle and made the record, Fiddling Missouri, in 1998.
Fiddling Missouri.
Or so.
And there is such in-depth descriptions of each tune that you've written there. I think that's as important or integral to those tunes and releases. I can read a paragraph, and sort of understand. If I'm not from around your area now, I have some great insight onto what these tunes are all about. I think that's really important about that release personally. Obviously, with you having a veteran musician and fiddler and then a young guy on a release is also great.
It was fun.
Yeah, I think it's such an important release, actually,
I kind
personally.
of got ahead of myself.
Yeah.
To back up just a paragraph.
Yeah,
We recorded that in Arkansas with Michael Bragg.
yeah.
In his Studio B, in other words, his basement. And then later, I took John with me to Seattle to record the Lewis and Clark Fiddle Tunes CD.
Yes,
That's two different
yes,
Voyager recordings.
yes.
But both have, I think, had some impact, because I met people all over, who might have picked a tune off of those recordings. The fiddle tunes of the Lewis and Clark era project was kind of neat, because that caused us to do what we love best, research, dig out what we thought might be the earliest recording and find a manuscript in a library or something. And it was really fun doing that. And there's a lot of great tunes that were played on the Lewis and Clark journey. They had two fiddlers with them, two fiddlers.
Two.
Yeah. One was terrific, the other not so great, but it didn't seem to matter. And they played the fiddle, all the way out to the ocean and back.
Amazing.
And very often a real keystone to their relationships with Native American tribal groups that they met along the way who'd never seen such a thing as these people and such a thing as a fiddle. Often they got out of some sketchy scrapes with some obstreperous Native American tribes that quite correctly said, "Why are you here and when are you leaving?"
Sure.
And what are you doing? And they would dance and play the fiddle and dance, and then everybody started dancing. Kind of interesting.
Yes.
Really a great moment in the history of the world in a way. Those first tribal encounters by Lewis and Clark had the fiddlers with them. Pretty interesting.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
Let's move a little bit forward here into back. Let's come back to Missouri a little bit, and can you talk a little bit about what you think your impact? First of all, what you think old time music community in Missouri, what that means, and moving into what it means to our city and our state, your city and your state. Obviously, we're very close to Columbia, so there's a lot of musicians out there. But what your impact on the old time music community in Missouri is? I know. I think that with obviously your books, your 3 books are what I call the authority of fiddle and music in Missouri, and it's such a great. I don't want to say reference guide, but it really is for me a reference. If I need to look up and understand, somebody mentions a fiddler's name and say, "Well, I don't quite know that name." Sure as gosh darn, it's in Keep It Old Time in there. You've got something.
Missed a few, but yeah.
Not too many.
Too many.
But talk about the old time music community in Missouri and your impact on the old time music community,
thank you.
especially, particularly for this as a fiddler, and a musician.
Well, I don't really know how to answer that. I don't consider I had a great impact as a person, but I put some stuff out there. I think that people appreciate that I couldn't have done if I hadn't been basically a scholar and a professor. Because everybody makes a fiddle record and they might give one sentence about the history of the tune on the back of the LP or something. That's all you ever know about it. And they don't even tell you who they are. So I gained this appreciation early on, for doing the research. And I think if anything, it's the research and recordings field recordings I've done scads of them. Over the years, it'll eventually be in the Historical Society in Columbia. That, like the books, I think people probably going to discover those in about 25 years and say, "What is that?" And that's what happens. It happened to me. First time I saw Howdy Forster play the fiddle backstage at the Grand Ole Opry in 1974, I said, "What is that? Is that Howdy Forster? My God!" You want to run out on stage and give him a big kiss and a big hug, because that's fiddling. That's one of the great fiddlers, and all my ancestors fiddling ancestors would talk about Howdy Forster and what his records were so great, and such a great fiddle player. And his style, by the way, fits very well with Little Dixie style. It's a notey, elaborate, sort of British style. That's not a sawing hoedown style.
So let's back up to that term you just said, Little Dixie style fiddling. Talked about dance fiddling. Talked about contest fiddling. If I had to put you in a box, would I call you a Little Dixie fiddler?
I guess so.
And what would that mean?
Well,
I know there's a lot to that. That's a loaded question, but
yeah, and the answer's loaded too, because it's kind of a construct.
yeah.
It isn't necessarily anything that you can pin down. It's like trying to trap mercury moving across the thing. You just can't. The more you push on it, then it spreads there and there. But the style that we take to be sort of Little Dixie, northeast, central Missouri, maybe Missouri Valley, although that's really confusing, what some call Missouri Valley style. I think you could kind of connect it to fiddlers in other regions. And even the Clark Kessinger's playing West Virginia, certainly Howdy Forster, Eck Robertson's 1920s recordings in Texas, when that kind of fiddling was still basically dance fiddling and entertainment rather than modern swing music. So it's not only found here, but it did beautifully here. And I think one of the reasons is that this part of Missouri has about 4,000 colleges. And so early on, colleges go back to the 1840s and 50s. So musical literacy, if you add the presence of all these colleges, the Virginians and Kentuckians were really big on starting colleges, quite often from one of the church groups, Protestant church groups. And you kind of track that all down, it suggests that there's a lot more musical literacy, quote unquote, in the pioneer times than anybody wants to admit. People who I knew who could read music and follow sheet music would swear on their dying death that they couldn't read music, because the so-called folklore community that I was once part of, still am I guess, always preferred people who were wearing overalls and, you know, spitting tobacco and saying, "Gee whiz, fellers." But that's not that simple if you live in a place like Columbia, Missouri. Taylor McBain worked for the university as an electrician, you know, for much of his life, and he played the fiddle every chance he had, and the president would call him up to the Jesse Hall to play the fiddle once in a while if he got bored, you know. So these people, and his big difference between, I think, this area in terms of these colleges, when they were founded, you know, the idea was to pass on, you know, the great ideas about civilization. You know, you need to know who Homer was. You need to read about Socrates and his tough time in jail. You need to know these things to be an educated person. And you might also want to know music. Music was considered part of the educated young person in my family and others in this area. I don't think it was in other parts of the United States necessarily, but it is in the places where these people I'm talking about came from, which would be bluegrass Kentucky, northern Kentucky, not the mountains, and on over into Piedmont, North Carolina, and Tidewater. The politics, the language, the traditions are different there from what we think of as old-time music, which maybe people would call it hillbilly music, you know. Is this really confusing? Yeah, it is.
Very much
It's taken
so.
me 50 years to figure out how to even explain it. I'm not explaining it very well now. But I've also found it quite interesting that the style I play is recognizable around the world, not as bluegrass fiddling, or I guess that's the closest thing to it would be bluegrass style. Not modern bluegrass style, but 50s and 60s, 70s bluegrass style, like Kenny Baker's playing. I could give you an interesting anecdote to kind of show you the relevance of this point. In the mid-90s, I spent a lot of time in the Scottish Lowlands doing an architectural history research project, but recording mostly farmsteads, but weavers' cottages and industrial sites around the lowlands between Glasgow and Edinburgh as a visiting scholar in the National Museum of Scotland in Edinburgh.
You had your fiddle with you?
Didn't?
No.
But anyway, I'll get to that.
Yes.
But so I was over there off and on a number of times, maybe 6, 7, 8 times. Stay a couple, 2 or 3 weeks at a time, come back on sabbatical as a professor. And each time I would go over there, I knew ahead of time this is possibly a place where there might be fiddlers. And more accordions than fiddles, but lots of fiddlers. So most of the time I would have access to a fiddle, or I would buy one. A couple of times I took the bus into Glasgow and went to the famous, I guess it's Artie's or one of those violin shops in Glasgow. And they're kind of funny, you know, I walked in and said, I want to buy a fiddle, and I don't have much money. I'm an American, I don't know anything. So if we start from there, what have you got? And it was in an old townhouse in Glasgow. So these are narrow buildings, so they go back about a half a mile, you know, 2, 3-story buildings. This famous violin store. So I said, well, I do have something that might interest you. And in the window, he had like a clothesline with a bunch of fiddles hanging off of it. And those were all the cheap, nothing, you know, ridiculous garbage fiddles that he had. I said, well, you can have any of those for whatever money you want to offer me. So I think it was 30 pounds or something like that, with a case and bow. So I'd gotten a pile of bows that looked like firewood and rattled them around and pulled out one that had some hair on it. Here's your bow. Got a cruddy old case. Here's your case. Thank you very much. See you tomorrow. Next day, bye. So I had a fiddle. I did that twice, and I'd bring them back with me, and then somebody would want to buy them. So I sold one to Virgil Smith. He had to have it, and I think it was made in Scotland, but wasn't of any value, pound-wise, you know, to the trade. So Virgil bought it, and then I think another fellow in Columbia bought the other one. So I always had a fiddle nearby, or even had one. So on one of these trips where I had this fiddle, I was by then by this trip I had figured out where I wanted to really stay, in a B&B at this farmstead, a really old, late medieval farmstead actually was still there, where the people had remodeled some of the old stone buildings for rooms.
Oh.
Very nice people, and one of their sons played the bagpipes, and they really liked the music. Their daughter played the piano accordion. Wonderful people. So as we got to know each other, I told them I really want to get out and hear some fiddle players. On my own, and had been to a couple of other places, and just like any country in the tourist world, there are different levels of places to go hear music. Mm-hmm. You can start up here at the pubs in Galway, where everybody knows about that pub, so you go there. And there's a kind of a second tier that might be public events that are passed around by word of mouth, but you would never know that if you were just a tourist. The third level in somebody's home is a jam session. So I focused in on that second kind. Where can I go to hear some fiddle music and maybe dancing, see some dancing where no other tourist will venture? So I did find a few of those places. One was a miners' hall in Newton Grange near Edinburgh. Interesting story how I found that. But anyway, this other one I want to tell you about, they're often in what are called miners' halls. This is an area of mining historically. Industrial, burned out, lower
working class
lowlands,
town,
just burned out,
Yeah.
by zillions of years of industrial development. Same time as where Watt invented the steam engine, so can't complain too much.
No.
Anyway, so this chap wanted to take me to this miners' hall. They have an annual kind of fiddle party, and they dance and have a wee dram and scones. It's just a delightful place, and in a town that nobody ever sees on the tourist tour. I knew this was going to be something interesting.
Oh, yeah.
So I walk in, and my host said, "Be sure you bring your fiddle." "Are you sure?" I said, "You really sure?" Okay, so I brought my fiddle under my arm, I walk in there, and of course, my host knows everybody. So the guy who's running the thing comes out and says, "Hey, Alistair, how you doing? How do you this big hello, and how you doing?" And he says, "I see your friend there. What have you got in the case?" Well, he said, "Well, it's a violin." He says, would you like to play tonight as a guest? And he was being very generous and very welcoming. That's another lower tier of Scottish people that you don't see if you just go on the tour. You don't see that really second level. They're kind of off-putting sometimes, and they don't like Americans famously. As a rule, they don't like Americans. They do like Canadians and Australians, New Zealanders. So anyhow, I said, "Yes, sir, I do have my fiddle. I'd be tickled to death at whatever I said, And he has, like a hootenanny back in the 60s, he's got a clipboard with times, and so, "Well, you're going to come on after so-and-so, and we'll give you 2 tunes." And he said, "But before you go, all my friends make me do this. I have to sort of test you, see if you have to kind of play a tune for you, see if you can actually play, if you don't mind, because I don't want to drive the customers away and blah blah blah." So okay. So I played a little bit of Angus Campbell for him, which I played fairly well, and it's a great Scottish tune, and he knew it immediately. It's great. You're on at such and such time. So he said, "Tell me who you are." So I said, "I'm Howard Marshall. I'm from a little town in Missouri. It's near St. Louis." So you learn early on to tell people you're from near St. Louis.
Near.
They'd never heard of Kansas City probably, but they know St. Louis. And so I'm from near St. Louis in Missouri. So he introduces me and he says, "And now we want to bring our new friend whose name was Howard Marshall." That's the way they pronounce it. Howard Marshall. And Howard is from Canada. He's going to play some great old Canadian tunes for you. So I played, Leather Breeches, McDonald's Reel.
Sure, McDonald. Okay.
And Angus Campbell. Now, what that tell you about my fiddling? The guy heard me as a Canadian fiddler, which is more like Missouri fiddling than it is like Ozark fiddling or Texas fiddling. I thought that was quite an interesting
Very
thing,
interesting, yeah.
From
Even though you
Canada.
told him you were from the States, he heard your
I
fiddling.
told him, and he even wrote it down,
Yeah.
St. Louis, But in the moment, you know, he just
He
went with
identified
it. He
you.
was Canadian.
Yeah.
Based on how I played the fiddle.
Yeah, and that lends itself to, you know, just from what I know from what you've read and what other publications and people talk about is those tunes come off the AM radio in the
Yeah.
old days.
Yeah, I heard it myself in the 1950s. You know, from Moberly, you could get, there was a big radio station in Ottawa somewhere, near Ottawa, and a big station in Minneapolis, and they both beamed a lot of fiddle music, a lot of polka music, and a lot of fiddle music. So I used to listen to that stuff myself at midnight.
And so you'd have those tunes already kind of preloaded in your mind already before you were even.
Well, those tunes, like Leather Britches, I knew just growing up because
Yeah.
people around me.
Everybody
played
plays.
that.
Yeah,
Angus Campbell, I actually learned from Cyril Stinnett.
yeah.
I heard other people play it, but when I heard Cyril play it, you know, a bomb went off in my head.
By golly, that's the version.
That's the tune I really like. I struggle to play it like I don't really, but I tried. You know.
If you had a tune to take with you on a desert island, this is also an unanswerable question. What's a tune you had to take to a desert island if you had to?
Just one.
If you had one
Am I
tune.
by myself or with others?
Yeah, that's a good. Well, I think you're with yourself and your
Yeah.
imagination.
Probably Liverpool Hornpipe.
Really?
Yeah, it's my favorite tune.
That's your favorite tune.
Yeah.
And that's an interesting tune for me because I'm a left-handed fiddler, and that left-handed fiddler, Jake Hockemeyer, right? And
Played a great version of it.
yeah,
A little fast for me, but boy, he played it like I like Benny Thomason's version.
Benny,
too.
yeah.
I met a lot of people that play it, you know, and been over in Galway and they played it there for me.
Yeah.
There, I wasn't invited to play, you know.
Really?
In the folk clubs. We got our boys here. Well, I'll cover the music, thank you. What do you have from the bar? You know, so, and it didn't really play in Galway. I knew better than to even pretend there, you know. They're cut to the bone pretty
So
fast.
you talked real quick. I want to go back to the desert island. Now, what if you had some backup with you? What if you had your favorite backup musicians, you know, with you, and you had the ensemble? What's that tune you're going to play at the pearly gates, if you will, or
The other gates. Yeah. Gee. I don't know that I could
yeah,
pin it now.
whatever come out at the time.
I might say piano.
Yeah, piano. Yeah,
It's I really like the sound of piano and fiddle together.
yeah.
I guess maybe that was my grandmother and grandfather playing in my head, you know. And I play a lot of the tunes they played. I also like guitar. You know.
Yeah.
I like banjo, believe it or not. I play banjo.
You're a banjo player, yeah.
And I do like it. I like mandolin. I like other instruments.
The piano and the fiddle go so well together because it's sort of they were in the homes, right?
Yeah.
These are the most
Every
common instruments.
parlor had one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Accordion in homes too.
Not
as
my
much.
recollection,
Yeah.
but I love accordion.
Yeah.
I really like it. I learned to play a tune. The version I play is stolen from, who's the chap that played so many years with Lawrence Welk? His accordion player.
Oh gosh.
You know who I'm talking about?
That's escaping
From
me.
Minnesota.
Oh.
Jenny Lynn Polka.
Yeah, Jenny
He
Lynn.
used to play that once in a while. I
It's-
thought, man, that's the best I've ever heard.
That's a good
I
one.
already played it on the fiddle, but I
Yeah.
started trying to play it like him.
I got you playing on a keyboard accordion.
Yeah.
Yeah. Got
But
it.
I'm blanking on the name just well.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'll
Yeah.
tell you tomorrow what the name is.
Frank Yankovic? Not him.
No.
Oh. That's all right.
I'll get it.
We'll get it tomorrow. So, is there anything? I mean, we're kind of winding down on this. I greatly appreciate you
Oh,
spending time here.
thank
and
you.
I can't think of a person that's more well deserving of a living traditions fellowship with not just your time in academia and your publications, but I find you personally to be a very influential fiddler because your take on the tunes is I don't want to say foreign to me because but just living in St. Louis and hearing a different and fresh approach to jam sessions and the way that your tunes are, I can clearly tell that you've culminated from the likes of Taylor and Pete, but you have your own take on a lot of tunes and almost I think of many times where we get stuck in playing the tune the same way. Now, not differently like you would in a Texas contest tune, but you have a different click maybe a couple times that you run through a tune, and you may kick off a tune even a little differently than you had before, and I always find that a fresh approach, inspiring, but also difficult too, because and some other old time, I think of Vesta Johnson like this, is where, well, she did that thing, and I just don't understand that. I can't hear. It just doesn't right. And sometimes I get that with your fiddle, and it has such a either that extra measure, or different lead in, or different turn. How'd you develop all that, and how does that work?
Well, just one or two or maybe three tunes I have with the extra measure, the extra beat. I got that from Art Galbraith.
Yeah.
And my first real heavy influence was Art Galbraith in the late 60s. And I visited him and recorded him in Springfield. And he's, by the way, he's a guy that opened up interesting background to fiddle playing as some sort of, could be scholarship even, you know. And
Yeah.
I wasn't a scholar at that point at all. I was still a kid.
Such a unique fiddler.
But yeah, unique fiddler, and he played some family tunes that he could trace back to 1840 exactly, when his great-grandfather brought him from Rogersville, northeastern corner of Tennessee, you know, to the Ozarks. And I wanted to play him like Art.
Yeah.
One of those that's kind of famous is a tune that you probably play in bluegrass sessions called Flowers of Edinburgh. I called it Flowers of Edinburgh for years, and Phil actually went to Edinburgh and said, "Oh, well, you must be an American." But that's a tune that he has those little extra things in, and he calls it Scotch Snap too, which is a British method.
It's certainly one of the hardest tunes to back up as far as where it's going.
It's just impossible. Yeah.
You can write it down and still not get it.
Yeah, I can do it. I'm playing on guitar.
You do a good job. I've heard you play it many
I
times.
learned that from Michael Bride.
Yeah.
Who was he was from Springfield, my age exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Who was the first young guitar player who came along who could get the chords that Art had in his head. Because Art himself didn't know the chords for a lot of those tunes. But Mike helped him kind of figure out the chords that would work for those tunes. That's a good example.
Yeah.
And others who've recorded with Art, they don't have quite the same lick tunes that Michael Bride had, who was the perfect accompanist for Art. And because of my respect for Art and fascination with his style, I wanted to kind of play his tunes as much as I could like he played them.
Interesting.
I still try to do that.
Interesting.
But they don't come out even sometimes, you know.
That's a really interesting take. You've spent a lot of time with a lot of these sort of what I consider the famous old time fiddlers here in the state of Missouri. I mean, there wasn't really any fame. These guys are doing what they're doing. I consider them the Mount Rushmore of Missouri fiddling of sorts of and you pick up some your fiddling to me is really, you can see all of those, you can hear and see and feel all of those guys in your playing, and that's why it's so intriguing and sometimes difficult to put a handle on. And so you can really tell the lifetime of you collecting all of this and work, and you know, really appreciating with these guys, and it comes out in your fiddling, I think. So what else do you want to add here about your community, traditional arts in Missouri, where you think the future's going, and that kind of thing?
We're lucky to have a lot of people in our state that care about these things, like you, Tom Coriell. Thank you. That's really important, you know, and sometimes an interest in these things skip a generation or two. And then the kid will come around and say, "Did somebody used to play the fiddle here?" Well, I've tried to improve on that, you know, so it's available through recordings and books and things.
Yeah.
So I think that's, I guess that'd be my main contribution, I think. And I don't know to what extent I really influenced that many people, but that's not my goal. My whole goal is just, you know, tell the history that isn't in the history books, and this is it, you know. It was really it more when I was just starting out way back in the 60s, you know, to do this stuff. Really unusual. thanks to a lot of well-known government programs, grants and so on,
Yes.
attention to tradition has become a good thing, more than it used to be,
Yeah.
rather than the rejection of the old just because it's old. But I always like the old stuff. I always like old people more than young people. And I guess I'm one on myself, so
Age is but a number.
yeah.
Well, thank you for your time. I greatly appreciate this chance to sit down and talk with you and
Thank
your
you,
great
Tom.
insight. And I look forward to some more jam sessions and
Yeah.
tunes and watching and hearing you and playing along with you and also the stories behind everything. You know, that's some of the better parts of
Yeah.
the stories in the community. So thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Appreciate it.
Yeah.